everybody. Welcome to tonight's virtual launch of the Objects the Thing. So here it is. So exciting. This is it. My name is Liz Crocker, and I'm a learning program developer here at the Royal BC Museum. And before we get started, I'm going to just mention the chat. I know some of you are joining on Facebook, but if you are in the Zoom room, just in case you haven't been into too many Zoom rooms, if you put your mouse down to the bottom of the screen, you should see a little chat sign pop up, and you can click on the chat and it'll show the chat where you can chat with the people in the room. And down at the bottom of that chat, you'll see it says to who you're sending the message to. I've got it set to all panelists and attendees, but you can actually click on that little menu. And if you wanted to send a message just to one of the panelists, you could do that. So just so that you're aware of that, but please feel free to put in there where you're joining us from. Who is that? Simone? Hey, Simone. Yes, so the chat. And I already introduced myself, so what I'm going to do is share my screen one more time. There we go. So I want to acknowledge that here at the museum, we are on the territory of the Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees and Esquimalt First Nation. I'm always very glad and so grateful that I get to acknowledge this territory, that I get to work and raise a family in. It's beautiful. And so tonight, we've got, the authors are here to talk about the book, but we have a little bit of agenda for you that I'm going to share. So first up, we're going to have Annie Mace from Royal BC Publishing is going to say a few words, and then Rob is going to share a presentation, and then after that, Rick will share a presentation. And somewhere in there, we're going to have a book giveaway for one lucky person's going to go home with the book tonight. And there will be time at the end for questions. And at the very, very end, Pam Murray from Interpretation Canada is going to come in and promote the event that we're doing tomorrow, that hopefully many of you can join us tomorrow. That's also about this wonderful new book. So just stop sharing that. And before I hand it over to Annie, actually, we have a quick poll, which Chris is going to hopefully be able to launch, where we have a question about Yorke Edwards. So now if you're not in the Zoom, if you're in Facebook, I'll read out the answers and the questions. So feel free to put your answers in Facebook, and we'll be able to see those. Chris will be able to see those. So we're just curious, who in the audience what kind of connection you have with Yorke Edwards. So the question is, what is your connection to Yorke Edwards? Multiple choice. So is it never heard of him, but don't know much about him? I've known him through his writing. I know people who knew or worked with him, or I knew Yorke myself. So in the Zoom, you should be able to select your answer now. Please feel free. Hopefully it's going to work. Doesn't work, you can put it in the chat.
It's working, Liz.
Is it working? Okay, because all I'm seeing is the frozen. Okay, so maybe if
I'll share the poll once.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. I'm just going to get rid of that question then. There we go. Anything coming in on Facebook? Ooh, Penticton, Margaret, Seal Territory. Oh, thanks for mentioning that, Margaret. Yes. It's wonderful at the beginning of these programs too, for everybody to have a think about the territory that you're joining us from. With these virtual programs, we have people from all over. That's been the one good thing about the pandemic, is reaching people in a wider audience. And it gives us all the opportunity to acknowledge the different territories that we live on. Okay, host is sharing the poll results, it says, Chris. Okay, so about 31% never heard of them. 17% heard of him, but don't know much. 11%, I've known him through his writing. Yeah, that's how I knew him. And I know people who knew or worked with him at 20%. And 26% of the audience, I knew Yorke myself, and none of the panelists could vote. So that's in the audience. 26% of the audience knew Yorke. That's very interesting. Okay, thank you, everybody. Anything different than that or extraordinary in that Facebook chat, Chris?
We have a couple of never heard of him, but one, Olivia, says, I never heard of him, but my last name is Edwards.
Ah, well, hey, that's a good connection. That's great. Thanks for joining, Olivia. All right, I'm going to hand things over to Annie Mace from Royal BC Publishing, and she's going to say a few words. Go ahead, Annie. You have to unmute yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Annie Mays. I'm the editor at the Royal BC Museum, and I'm joining you from Saanich Traditional Territory tonight. Thank you so much for joining us for the launch of The Objects, the Thing, the writings of Yorke Edwards, a pioneer of heritage interpretation in Canada. This is an important book, but it's also a really interesting and engaging one, which I don't think we can say for every important book that we publish. So I'm really glad that we're getting the chance to share it with you tonight. I'm sure many of you know the authors, but for those who don't, please allow me to introduce Dr. Rob Cannings and Dr. Rick Kool. Rick Kool began his professional life as a secondary school science teacher before joining the Royal BC Museum as an education officer, ending his time here as director of public programs. He was the environmental education coordinator for the BC Ministry of Environment and coordinated park interpretation within BC Parks before joining Royal Roads University in 2003, where he established their Masters in Environmental Education and Communication program. Rick is now a professor in Royal Roads School of Environment and Sustainability. Rob Cannings is curator emeritus at the Royal BC Museum, where he was curator of entomology from 1980 to 2013 and managed the natural history section from 1987 to 1996. Before that, he was a biologist and nature interpreter for BC Parks and the Canadian Wildlife Service. He is a fellow of Okanagan College and a recipient of the Bruce Naylor Award, which recognizes exceptional contributions to the study of museum-based natural history in Canada. On his retirement, he received the Royal BC Museum's Lifetime Achievement Award. So both Rob and Rick are Royal BC Museum alumni, and we're very pleased to have been able to work with them on this book about another Royal BC Museum veteran, former director R. Yorke Edwards. Yorke Edwards' work has been tremendously influential in the field of interpretation in Canada, and through their diligent collection of his writings, Rob and Rick have illuminated his legacy and his influence for a new generation. I will pass the proverbial mic over to Rob now, but first, let me just say that the book is officially available now at rbcm.ca/books, and it will be available from your favorite bookseller as of midnight tonight. Rob, over to you.
Thanks, Annie.
I think I've done something wrong here.
We can hear you and we can see you in the mountains there.
Okay. Thanks, Annie. Before I begin, I'd like to say that there are many people to thank, and Rick will do this later, but I want to express my personal gratitude to Eve and Annie and Audrey, the museum's publishing team, and for the special help of 4 others, Yorke's daughters, Anne and Jane, and my good friends Trevor Goward and Bill Merrilees, who have long championed Yorke's legacy. There are strong parallels between my presentation and Rick's tonight, and you'll see a few images more than once. We hope that this is not too distracting. My talk is mostly bits and pieces read from the book. So, I need to get onto my PowerPoint here. I'm just not at the beginning of my show.
Okay, I think Chris is on the way.
I can just whip by like this. Okay, here we go.
Oh, there we go.
Sorry for that glitch. This is a overdue tribute to a man whose long career with BC Parks, the Canadian Wildlife Service, and the Royal BC Museum still affects how we experience our natural and human heritage today. Yorke Edwards put his innovative ideas into action and touched many people. I was one of them. He hired me as a summer park naturalist in BC Parks when I was a teenager. I followed him to Ontario and worked as an interpreter at his Marsh Wildlife Center, and I ended up as curator for many years in his beloved Provincial Museum in Victoria. This is a brief outline of his working life. In 1944, 19-year-old Yorke Edwards wrote to Rudolph Anderson, Chief of Biology at the National Museum of Canada, with pointed questions on the focus of his budding career in zoology. Anderson answered with a letter full of details on small mammal identification, the building of collections, and the life of a working zoologist. Recognizing the commitment in Edwards' letter, Anderson thoughtfully took considerable time from a demanding job to encourage the young man's growth as a biologist. He wrote Edwards several times in the early 1940s with information, literature, and guidance on publishing, and was instrumental in publishing Yorke's first scientific paper, Notes on Two Captive Meadow Jumping Mice, in the Canadian Field Naturalist of 1945. Anderson's confidence in Edwards was not misplaced. The eager student grew into a man whose thoughts and energies have helped shape the minds and lives of countless naturalists across the country. For almost half a century, Yorke Edwards was a pioneer in wildlife biology, nature education, conservation, and museum life, stimulating people to think more deeply about the world and our place in it. Roger Yorke Edwards was born in Toronto in 1924. He was an only child, self-contained, self-motivated. Reading the nature writings of Ernest Seton and Thornton Burgess plunged him into biology. The colorful Audubon bird charts that hung on the walls of his Toronto school drove him to memorize the plumages of all the species he came across. His first birding notebook began in January 1937 when he was just 12 years old. Yorke's passion for birds during high school was shared by his friend John Crosby, who later became one of Canada's foremost bird artists. Beginning in 1940, the two rode around Toronto on their bicycles, birding fanatically. Yorke wrote a lot, even in those early days. His diaries and field notes are highly organized and filled with exquisite detail, augmented by sketches and photographs. The tone is serious and earnest. He's very clear that observing and understanding nature is his life. Several teenage manuscripts were rejected, but there were successes. One of Yorke's first published articles, illustrated by Crosby, was a result of their intense birding activity. Rick will mention this too. It's a fine little piece entitled Six Wood Warblers, printed in 1942 in Canadian Nature. The magazine's editor and the Royal Ontario Museum staff who reviewed it were impressed. This is the acceptance letter. Yorke and his friends became enthusiastic members of the Royal Ontario Museum's Intermediate Naturalist Club. Some of these friends are well known in biological and naturalist circles. Robert Bateman and Bristol Foster are two who ended up in BC. In the labs and collections of the museum, Yorke was encouraged in his bird and mammal interests by James Bailey, about whom Rick will tell you more later. Yorke donated specimens to the collection. The gift of a couple of moles is documented above. Here were the origins of the wildlife biologist and museum man. While studying forestry at the University of Toronto in 1946, Yorke attended a lecture by the University of BC's Ian McTaggart Cowan on wildlife research in the Rocky Mountain National Parks. Yorke was enthralled and eagerly accepted Cowan's invitation to study with him. After graduating from Toronto, Yorke arrived in BC in 1948 and over the summer worked on a waterfowl nesting and banding survey in the Caribou and Chilcotin regions, accompanied by his friend Alan Brooks Jr. By the way, they're eating spaghetti and canned green beans here. The next summer, he made a biological survey of Manning Provincial Park, a place that was destined to play a large role in his career. Yorke finished his master's degree in 1950. The next year was a momentous one. He accepted a position with the BC Forest Service in Victoria and married Joan Thick in Vancouver, Joan's hometown. They had met in Toronto the year before while Joan was working as a bacteriologist in the Connaught Medical Research Laboratories there. By the way, she worked on the polio vaccine, something that's sort of interesting in today's context. Yorke's job was to head the newly formed research section of the Parks Division. And from 1951 to 1959, he ran studies of wildlife and its management in BC parks. Much of Yorke's research in the 1950s was concentrated in the wilds of Wells Gray Park, and his primary studies focused on the biology of mountain caribou and moose. Then in 1957, Yorke championed a new cause, nature interpretation in BC parks. Rick will discuss this interpretation in more detail. Anyway, that summer, Yorke scrounged a mildewed tent and frame and set them up in Manning Park. Inside were exhibits of rocks, flowers, bird pictures, beaver workings, and all sorts of other things. A sign announcing Nature House hung over the door. Although apparently because of the sign, the place was frequently mistaken for a washroom, the interpretation program flourished. A new building soon followed and the program expanded, bringing more nature houses, interpretive signs, nature trails, and naturalist talks to many parts of the province. As a manager and supervisor, Yorke was thoughtful, innovative, and tireless. He was also charming, humorous, and warm-hearted. He was hands-on, working continually with park naturalists to help improve their messaging and delivery. In 1960, Yorke was on the road for 75 days, driving from park to park, checking on the skills and morale of the summer naturalists, seeking ideas for exhibits, drafting new park pamphlets and signage, and looking for places to start new park programs. By the time Yorke left BC Parks in 1967, there were 4 nature houses and programs in 9 parks. More came later. Yorke explained their purpose as the enhancing of public understanding, care, and recreational enjoyment of the natural environments preserved in parks. Widely admired, the program set a standard for park education across the country. Yorke was also influential in BC's growing naturalist community. In the early 1960s, he helped found the BC Nature Council, the forerunner of the Federation of BC Naturalists, which organizes the province's many naturalist clubs. At the same time, he was also active in the museum community, especially in the BC Museums Association, founded after the province's 1958 centennial, inspired the creation of many new community museums. So even while he worked for the Parks branch, he influenced small museums all across the province. In the Canadian centennial year of 1967, David Munro, the director of the Canadian Wildlife Service, envisioned a series of wildlife interpretation centers stretching from sea to sea, each explaining the distinctive life zone in which it was located. Munro asked Yorke to come to Ottawa and duplicate his provincial achievement on a national basis. Yorke accepted, but agreed to stay for only 5 years. From 1967 to 72, Yorke worked on this new national vision. He planned the development of a series of nature centers, building the first one at Marsh, a rich southern Ontario wetland. After Yorke's tenure, 4 more centers were built across Canada, from Bonaventure in the Gaspé of Quebec to Creston in the Kootenay region of BC. Work on the transcontinental vision continued until the mid-1980s, when slashed budgets doomed the program. Some centers completely disappeared. Others, such as Marsh and Creston Valley, were repurposed through private-public partnerships. Yorke returned to Victoria in 1972 to become the assistant director of the Provincial Museum, then led by Bristol Foster, Yorke's acquaintance from his youthful Royal Ontario Museum days. Yorke became director in 1975. His museum experience in Toronto, his biological background, his extensive involvement with exhibits and public education in both natural and human history, and his work with the BC Museums Association all prepared him for managing a major museum. Yorke strongly believed in collections, research, and inspirational public programming. He helped guide the development of much of the new museum building's early permanent exhibits. Under his tenure, which was often fraught with government-wide budget cuts, major exhibits such as the first People's Gallery and the Natural History Gallery, Living Land, Living Sea, were completed. Although a successful administrator of major government programs and a large museum, Yorke was happiest in the field. In 1981, just 3 years before his retirement, he joined the museum's Brooks Peninsula expedition to the remote northwest coast of Vancouver Island. He went not as the museum director, but as a field assistant to help museum staff collect and observe. Yorke retired from the museum in late 1984, but continued writing and working as a consultant. He was also made an RBCM curator emeritus. He usually spent 1 day each week in the biology collections, mainly researching the historical mammal collecting expeditions in BC made by major North American museums. Throughout his long career, Yorke presented hundreds of talks and speeches on many subjects to many audiences, from school children to scientific societies, from naturalist clubs to politicians and seniors groups. And the scope of his writing is impressive. He published over 400 titles. Some of his early writings and papers on wildlife and forestry are minor classics, many of those dealing with nature interpretation, parks and museums, which were perhaps his most influential, are the main subject of this new book. He wrote extensively about research and science and museums. He also wrote widely on his first love, birds, and watching them from the sunroom and patio of his lovely home overlooking Juan de Fuca Strait with a beer in his hand was a favorite pastime. Naturalist newsletters and magazines are full of his articles about people in the natural world. He wrote dozens of book reviews and forwards to books, and he wrote a few books of his own. Among them, The Mountain Barrier is a popular treatment of the ecology of the mountains of the Western Canadian region, and The Land Speaks detailed Yorke's philosophy about nature interpretation and its implementation. Just as Rudolf Anderson's advice to Yorke years earlier convinced him that biology could be his life, Yorke's friendly, down-to-earth counsel helped many young people on their way. There are others like me who count Yorke as a significant influence on their lives. Hundreds of students who have been park naturalists in BC and across Canada, whether they know it or not, have been affected by his ideas. Today, they are biologists, university professors, artists, doctors, lawyers, teachers, parents. Thousands of others who have visited parks, wildlife centers, and museums, or who have read his articles and heard his talks, have come away with a bit of Yorke Edwards. He changed lives. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. You can go ahead. Thank you very much. Go ahead, Rick.
Okay, I'll get my screen shared here. Okay, well, I hope this is all set up right. Thank you, Annie, and thank you, Rob. And I'd like to talk a little bit about interpretation, but also about Yorke in maybe a slightly different angle from the way Rob's presented him. So I came to the Royal BC Museum in 1978 when Yorke was the director, and I left the museum in 1991, moved to BC Parks, Ministry of Environment, and then BC Parks, and then in 2003 to Royal Roads. Here I am leading a tour. You can see the ladder on the side of the image. The natural history exhibit was not yet full. I have no idea what we were really looking at, but this little person here in my arms is now 41 and has his own little person. So this is a bit dated, but I don't look any different from that. As I note in my chapter of the book, for me personally, this publication was my way of apologizing to Yorke Edwards for not making a stronger connection with him, for not learning more from him, for not seeing this man as someone I could learn a lot from. I liked Yorke and respected his work as the director of the Provincial Museum, but in retrospect, it wasn't enough. I did not get to know him as I should have, and I've regretted that. And so he's been in my mind a lot of my adult life. In the years since I left the Royal BC Museum and then left BC Parks, Rob and I have occasionally talked about what we should do with Yorke's writings, both his unpublished talks and papers and what I would call his marginally published writings, writings that were published, but that would be very hard to find today. These conversations went on over years until finally, in the summer of 2018, I wrote to Rob that we should really get going with this. And while I didn't retire in 2020, as I say in my email I'm thinking of doing, the museum, ultimately through Eve Rickards, the museum publisher, thought our idea had merit and gave the green light to go ahead. And so for the next 18 months or so, Rob and I pulled together Yorke's material as it related to his thinking about interpretation. Through 2019 and 2020, we did all the work needed to scan, proofread, and assemble these documents into a coherent sequence. And as Yorke wrote about park and heritage interpretation for more than 30 years, we had, as you saw from Rob, we had a lot to work with. We had to gain permissions to use his writings, and we got them from a variety of organizations. Photographs were offered by the Edwards family, good friends at BC Parks, Marsh Nature Center, and others with connections to Yorke in the early days of BC Parks. And after that, we ended up with our present volume. And so we do have to thank people. We have to thank Bob Peart, especially, for writing the preface, which is a wonderful preface about Yorke. And then all these people, don't need to name them all, but they were all involved in this project in many important ways, and we want to thank them all. And we also want to thank the young naturalist in this picture, Frank Buffum. Yorke wrote about him in his journal, a hard and intelligent worker. Frank is a retired professor of ophthalmology at the University of British Columbia's medical school, and I'm very grateful he's here tonight on the Zoom call. Now, how did Yorke Edwards become the father, you might say, of park interpretation in BC and in Canada? So I'd like to speculate a little bit about some of the components. First of all, he was adventurous. He was an adventurous youth, getting out and about, looking for birds in the Toronto of the early 1940s. And he wrote about this He wrote, "Field clothes are often a bit on the worn out or disreputable side, or at least they were in the day when money was scarce, and the city naturalist frequently found himself on city buses and streetcars. Sundays were good times to get out with binoculars, notebooks, and an assortment of equipment in a pack sack. The early morning rides out were usually uneventful. The city still slept, aside for a few shift workers and the occasional all-night party people, but the return trip was another matter. The ride back was among crowds of people dressed in their best and on their pious way home from church. Never was civilized man so stiffly civilized. And there we were among them, tattered, often wet, usually dirty, and hung with queer equipment. We were acutely aware of disapproving glances. And we seemed to get special reactions when the weather was wet and heavy field clothes gave off their special perfume, or when the pack sack held a special treasure like a gull or a mole that was very dead and on its way home for careful indoor study." He was adventurous. He was also really curious. So not only did he love getting out in nature and love looking at organisms, he found that the exhibits and information located in museums enhanced his understanding and even gave his life a more serious direction. And again, he wrote, "Early in high school years in Toronto, I discovered the Royal Ontario Museum. I went there often, as I recall, perhaps too often. For looking back, I suspect that I was underfoot a lot, but everyone was kind and patient, and perhaps I was shy enough about the high status of my museum heroes that my visits were not too long. My invasion of the ROM and its invasion of me were piecemeal processes. At first, the public galleries were the sole attraction. In the public gallery, I soon made friends. Security guards and the sales lady in the museum shop saw me so much that their curiosity prodded them into speaking to me. Through them, I began to suspect that behind the closed doors was the real museum. Perhaps a year later, being increasingly active as a birdwatcher, I was meeting other bird addicts in the wilder fringes of Toronto, and one of them I found to my joy worked at the ROM. Jim Bailey was Toronto's top robin in the bird chasing set, and his office at the museum became my entrance into mysterious back rooms and storage areas that were the heart of the museum. Many a museum-struck kid hangs about so much that in desperation, someone gives him work to do. This will, so the theory goes, either get rid of him or make him useful. So I eventually found myself working at the ROM." And finally, Yorke was literate, and from an early age, he could express himself quite well on paper and in person. His first published piece on wood warblers set a high standard for clarity and expressiveness that he pursued for the rest of his writing career. He fell in love with the natural world and learned what he could from direct experience with the flora and fauna of his surroundings. But he also learned from his museum experiences that there was much more to be learned from a specimen or object through the assistance of a knowledgeable person, be they disembodied in the form of an exhibit text or in person, as was his experience with Jim Bailey. And as Yorke was curious about people and nature and wanted others to share in the excitement of learning about nature, he found a skill as a writer to lead him to consider the various means by which one can invite others to see the beauty and wonder of the natural world all around them. As you've heard from Rob, Yorke moved to BC, did his master's degree with Ian McTaggart-Cowan at UBC, and began working for the BC Forest Service's Parks Branch as a research officer. And at some point, he decided to deal with his concern that people just weren't appreciating the incredible environments all around them. And so he wrote, scenery watching is a fine thing, and some people, like landscape painters, can use nature quite efficiently in this way. But most people think they're through with scenery once they have glanced at it. If this is true, our parks are an expensive luxury that we cannot afford. It's people like these who drive to a park, stop once in the park, then jump into their cars to drive on to the next park. They will tell you later about the parks they have seen. They saw them all right as wallpaper. So after spending several years harassing the head of Park Service in 1957, Yorke was given $300 as a summer student and told to create something in Manning Park. And he wrote, for that center, I was given a university student to help and enough money to buy only nails, paint, and materials for handmade labels and signs. We salvaged 2 wooden tent floors from a deserted construction camp, found 2 discarded tents in the local forestry station, and these we made into the first nature house. The local refuse dump yielded treasures like boxes, pails, and tubs with repairable leaks, bits of wood for signs and other free supplies. A distant artist friend sent rough paintings of local birds for an exhibit. We photographed things, made diagrams, created catchy titles, found objects in the wild surroundings, and combined all these things into exhibits. Each simple message was somehow illustrated by objects or pictures, and each one just outside the tent. The first center got results at small costs because it could only afford to be as simple and as creatively effective as possible. Creative thinking in a garbage heap or in a nature center need not be costly. And he really felt it was a huge success. They had 13,000 people in that first year. And in fact, we recently, like in the last few days, found this paper. It was his first paper that Yorke wrote about interpretation in 1958. And he wrote here, on opening day, the nature house was described by one visitor as he approached it as looking like a cook tent for a construction crew. Yet the response of the public was immediate. 3 days later, 1,000 people had viewed the exhibits, and it was obvious that the Parks Branch was in the interpretation business. And so they were at Manning Park and then elsewhere. And so through this time, Yorke began to hone in a very analytical way, as I was a science kind of analytical guy, his ideas about interpretation. So 5 years after the opening of the park in 1962, he wrote, a nature interpretation program is one of the most complicated things imaginable if it is broad in scope and uses a number of techniques to deliver its message to the public. It is so complicated that I'm sure there never will be a really adequate nature interpretation program. The complete program would be too vast to even outline adequately here. But as a partial outline, let me offer the following. There should be a complete and accurate knowledge of most parts of botany, zoology, anthropology, local history, ecology, meteorology, and geology. But accurate and detailed knowledge of these is not enough. There must be present an ability to give these facts to people who know little or nothing about them, being at the same time simple and accurate while using few words and using everyday words. In short, we're describing an interpreter who knows all about everything in the natural sciences, and in spite of his knowledge and of his job to pass on this knowledge, he would never appear to be an intellectual. Sometimes, however, I think that the description just given portrays a deadly dull interpreter. This Superman would do fairly well as an interpreter, but I'm sure that I've seen better interpreters than he would be. One of the best that I've met and recently hired is a 70-year-old man, Freeman King, a 70-year-old man who knows little about many fields of natural history, and in several fields, I admit that he is a goldmine of misinformation. But he has one glorious attribute that more than makes up for his shortcomings as an encyclopedia, and this is his ability to inspire people into becoming permanently and actively interested in natural history. There could be no greater attribute in an interpreter than infectious enthusiasm. So as Yorke is developing these ideas, in 1964, he laid out a synthesis of what his idea of interpretation was. He wrote, so what is interpretation in parks? It's showing people real things, orienting people with direction and facts, informing people with well-chosen words, inspiring people into the action of learning more for themselves, entertaining them so that people will come to you to be shown, oriented, informed, inspired, and entertained. To do these things, an interpreter must know what he is talking about and know how to say it so that people listen. In 1979, Yorke wrote, "Interpretation is communication about things that are right there helping to communicate. The ingredient that transforms information into interpretation is supplied by the presence of the real thing. The subject itself does much of its own communication simply by being there. Using things and other methods of communication appropriate to his purpose, the successful interpreter has the ability to reach into people's minds and there to create interest, understanding, delight, revelation, and sometimes a lifelong new interest. Interpretation's purpose is to change people by exposing them to nature, to their environment, to landscapes, to the world about them, which all means much the same thing." I found in going through Yorke's writing that he uses many words that I've long been fond of, words that I've used to describe what I hope to do as a teacher. He uses the term revelation 6 times in our manuscript. I've long believed that part of the job of any teacher is to work towards revealing things that are hidden, at the same time being open to revelation themselves. For example, Yorke says, "There's nothing mysterious about interpretation. It uses the most effective methods available to try to infect its audience with interest, enthusiasm, and revelation." Elsewhere, he wrote, "Interpretation sows seeds, skillfully chosen, imaginatively treated, that will grow into inspiration, revelation, involvement, and in some cases, a new lifelong passion." Another one of the terms that he uses a lot is inspiration. He wrote, "Interpretation operates on the spot, with real things that are in meaningful surroundings. This is the strength of nature interpretation, and this is why inspiration and revelation can so often be its result." To me, what Yorke is saying is that the work of an interpreter is to be an enthusiastic purveyor of inspiration. Remember the 5 words he used to characterize interpretation: shows, orients, informs, inspires, entertains. Inspires or inspiration occurs 43 times in our book, far more than any of the other 5 terms. And I'm really, really pleased that the woman who was my first doctoral student, Dr. Jackie Gilson, who's on the call tonight, has recently published an expanded version of her doctoral dissertation in a new book that I am sure is going to be a classic in the field. And the adjective enthusiastic or enthusiasm also makes a frequent appearance in the text. Indeed, Yorke's successor at BC Parks, Kerry Joy, wrote in 1970 in a report about visiting the Marsh Center that Rob mentioned in Ontario. Kerry wrote, "An interpreter without enthusiasm is like stale, warm beer." I like that. Yorke himself wrote in 1964, "Give me these things, know-how and enthusiasm, and I'll hire him even if he has 2 heads, if he can also get what he knows across to other people." There's a lot more in his book, but enough of me talking. Let me finish with the final words of Yorke in our book, words written in 1907 after he retired from the BC Museum, words that really resonated with me again as a teacher. He wrote, "Interpretation is satisfying work, often pure pleasure. The rewards most memorable with the pleasures of watching the dawn of understandings on people's faces and the satisfactions of observing people finding delight in discovering the details of the Earth's surface. Even so, such feedback is fragmentary. Like all educators, interpreters never know how far the ripples travel from where they have dropped their new understandings." So thank you to all the folks at the museum. Thanks to Rob for making this project such a joyful one for me to do.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks for those words, and thanks for Rob's words. Rick, I'm wondering, before we go ahead to questions, I suspect there'll be some questions for both of you. Did you want to share that video? Are you able to share the video? Yeah. Okay, I'll let you do that.
Just give me a sec to get the slideshow dead.
All right, and in the meantime, folks can have a think about something you might like to ask the authors.
So this is, I've been lately taking up making little iMovies. And I just strung a bunch of things together. Again, just another way of, it's 5 minutes, just another way of seeing the story of Yorke Edwards.
Thanks for sharing that, Rick. And I saw someone typed in the chat about nice touch with the birds. That was a lovely, lovely touch.
And I'm
Thanks.
sure we could have a contest. There's probably dozens of people on this call who could actually identify most, if not all, of the birds there, but I tried to match them up to the habitat. I'm not a birder, but this is my little token, for the birders.
I was going to ask if the birds matched the picture. So you tried to, of course you did. Okay, that was excellent. And I also noticed when you were speaking as well, somebody was mentioning how relevant Yorke Edwards' language still is today. About when he speaks of interpretation, it is. It's so still very vital and contemporary language. And I was going to mention it later, but I'll just say, when I was reading Rob's chronology of Yorke Edwards' career, I was so happy to read that chronology, Rob, because I had no idea about his career. I was a young park naturalist years ago, and it would have been really great to be able to fit myself in that world. And the folks that I worked with, many of them were influenced by Yorke Edwards. So I was really grateful to both of you for this book.
It was interesting, and something we note at the beginning of the book, and I do think his ideas are very much very, very useful for us. Now, it's interesting, we had a discussion about his language, because in fact, she and her and female language essentially doesn't show up in his writing, that his interpreters are men. And we note that at the beginning, rather than trying to play with the language, we laid it out there. And because we know that Gail Ross, who was on here today, the first woman full-time BC Park interpreter, and the women have been very important, very, very important influences in interpretation. But it didn't begin this way. And Yorke's language, while contemporary in some ways, is very dated in other ways.
Absolutely. Yes, good point. Okay, thank you, Rick. And thank you, Rob. We are going to have some time for questions, but before we do that, we are going to give away one of the books to one lucky person that is here in the presentation this evening. So I'm going to ask a question that both Rob and Rick actually gave the answer in their presentation. If you're in Facebook, you can write it in the chat. And if you're in Zoom, you can just write it in the chat. And my colleague, Chris, is watching things very carefully. And the first person to get the correct answer is going to win the book. And Chris will talk with you separately and get your address, and we will mail it to you. So the question is, where did Yorke Edwards organize his first interpretive program? Don't answer it yet, Rick. Where did Yorke Edwards organize his first interpretive program? I see we've got answers coming in already, so I'm going to let Chris deal with that. Okay. Chris, I think we have enough. Can I go ahead and say the answer? Because I see so many, I can't see Facebook.
We do, yes.
Okay, all right. So many of you are right. I could see in the Zoom chat, it was Manning Park. Well done. Even if you didn't win a book, you can go out and get the book, as Annie suggested. You can go to the RBCM publishing page and purchase it. But yay, congratulations to the lucky winner, and we'll get your information and mail that out to you. So I know I have seen many comments in there in the chat, but we'll just see if anybody in the room or on Facebook has any questions for our authors. Let's see. Oh, and I see one in the Q&A, which is nice. Let's go here. Oh, okay, from Scott Gilmore. And this could be to both of you or either of you. What was the most surprising or unexpected thing that you learned during the writing of this book? Love that question. Most unexpected or surprising. Rob or Rick, who wants to take that? Rick's waving. Go ahead.
I was waving at Rob.
Oh,
Well,
go ahead, Rob.
I was going to say, Rick didn't know Yorke as well as I did, so he probably found some things that were more surprising. But I knew Yorke really pretty well, and this was just this book was a trip back in time for me, back to my teenage years, my university years, and all those years that I knew him. And so I can't think of anything that was really surprising. I think getting to know Yorke's daughters, Anne and Jane, was the most interesting thing for me. And not that it was surprising, but hearing their stories of their father and how he taught them all about the natural world was a revelation to me.
Kind of gave you another angle
Yeah.
on him, hey?
So I don't know if they're here tonight, but I hope they are.
Anne is here. Yes.
Oh,
So for me, well, as Rob said, I just didn't. I mean, I had some really wonderful interactions with Yorke at the museum. He gave me permission, for example, to spend one afternoon a week organizing the fossil collection, a collection that hadn't been touched since C.F. Newcomb died in the early 100 years ago now, or more than 100 years ago now. And so I got to play in the fossil collection and do some work on that. But for me, reading his material, he was funny. There are some pieces that we put in the book where he's describing hunting on that trip that he came going up to the Chilcotin on a bird and mammal trip, and going out really being really sitting around it's hot, it's humid. He went off to get away from the mosquitoes, and he took a little shotgun with him thinking he could get some squirrels for the collecting he was doing for the ROM. And he saw a little squirrel and he got closer and closer to it, and then bam, blasted it, and it disappeared into this pile of wood. They were cutting a cross BC telegraph line or telephone line at the time. And so he describes himself pulling the wood away to look for where this little squirrel might have gone, with his behind in the air. And then he feels himself being watched. And he comes out of this, this pile of wood debris that he's had his bottom up in. And there's two Chilcotin First Nations guys sitting on horses watching him. And he tries to explain himself to these two guys, these real hunters, that in fact he couldn't, with a shotgun, he couldn't get this little squirrel. It's a very funny piece, and there's more of that. He's willing to make fun of himself in the book, and he's very perceptive of other people. And since I didn't pay enough attention to him, I didn't see that aspect of him at the museum, but I sure see it now. And I kick myself even more now that I didn't get to know him better, because I think it was just a missed opportunity in my life. We all have them, but I've been maybe fortunate to actually recognize it and posthumously, along with Rob, try to apologize in a way.
Well, I'm sorry you didn't get to know him the way you wanted to, Rick, but if the result is the book, it's good for us. I mean, maybe it wouldn't have haunted you as much if you had, who knows? Well, maybe Rob would have written the book. Rob, there's actually a question here for you specifically. It's Michelle Seeley. She says, I noticed that in one of the photos of Yorke Edwards and Freeman King, there was a third gentleman with the surname of Cannings. Is he related to you?
He is indeed. That was my father, who was a very active naturalist, and I could very well say interpreter for many, many years in the Okanagan Valley, and he was very active in British Columbia natural history circles for much of his life. So yeah, he was my dad. And I actually took that picture when I was a kid.
How old were you? Do you remember how old you were?
Well, it was 1964, so I was whatever.
Back then, whatever. Okay, thank you, Rob.
I see that Simone Runyon has a question that's kind of an interesting one.
Okay, go ahead.
With Freeman Tilden. And, as far as I can tell, they may have written, but I never saw any letters.
Sorry, Rick, what is the question? I don't see it. Can you say what it is?
Do you know more about Yorke's relationship with Freeman Tilden? And that's the first part of the question. And I memean, obviously they would have known each other. In fact, Yorke wrote in one of the essays that we've reprinted that Tilden's book on interpreting our heritage was something he advised all of his summer interpreters to really get comfortable with, so I think Yorke's work in Manning originally was very much inspired by Tilden, who published that book in 1957. So, the BC, the U.S. National Park Service was, and Yorke recognized it, was ahead of Canada in interpretation. But I'm not sure they ever met more than that one time. And all we have even of that, we don't even have the negatives. It's just a contact sheet, as you saw, with that picture on it. And
Yeah,
then
I'd love.
Simone asks you the question, how did he influence you? How did Yorke influence you?
Oh, Rob.
Oh, sorry. Well, first of all, he gave me my first really important, what I consider important job as a 16-year-old summer student at Miracle Beach Park back in 1965. And he was there often. He would come up from Victoria and he would talk about research, and he would take us on walks through the park. And he encouraged all the naturalists to be individualistic and to work hard and to learn about the park, obviously, and to learn the interpretive skills that were necessary. But he took his relationships with all his staff, 16-year-old kids, very seriously, and he taught us a lot about how to mentor, I think, the younger generations that come after and that you can influence. And I consider him one of the 3 or 4 significant mentors in my life. You can see by my bio, I followed him all over the place. He kept offering me jobs. And so I have to say he was a major influence on my life.
And in the same way, when I first met Dr. Frank Buffin, who was mentioned only obliquely through much of Yorke's early writings, and then in one place mentioned there was a doctor who was going into medical school. When I met Dr. Buffin here in Victoria, he said just what Rob said, that he told me that Yorke was the best teacher he ever had. And he wasn't a formal teacher in a classroom setting, not like a medical student would have in school. But that also just really touched me, that here was this wonderful man who remembers Yorke as being the best teacher that he ever had. So obviously I never knew Yorke as an interpreter, as a young interpreter, and at the museum, he didn't get in my way. I was doing lots of funny things at the museum, and he never told me not to. And maybe that was his gift to me, was giving me the space to do as many crazy things as possible and see what happened as a result.
Thanks, Rick. I think we're almost at the top of the hour, and so I think we will allow time for one more question, but I just want to make sure you see the comments here from Jane Edwards, who must be Yorke's daughter, who says, "Thank you, Rob and Rick. This book on Dad's written work about interpretation. You have helped me see a different angle of him and his life work." That's wonderful. So there's a question from Catherine Etmansky. Sorry, Catherine. What can we learn from Yorke's example about ongoing work to address the climate crisis, especially as we emerge from this pandemic? I'm going to end it on a hard question. What do you think about that? Any thoughts on that, Rick or Rob?
Yorke was really interested in connecting people, but not just connecting it. I missed one of my slides intentionally because I was running out of time. But one of Yorke's ideas that I think was really prescient at the time was he talked about 2 stances for interpretation. One he called object in, and one he called object out. And the object out orientation is taking whatever it is we're dealing with, the landscape that Rob's sitting in front of, or an organism, and putting it into the very large context. And I think, the all these environmental crises we're seeing is, and if you just read the literature and science or nature and the journals, there's many things that we really need to be worried about. I think Yorke would say we could connect those things that are in front of us, the objects the object that's the thing we're interpreting, and connect it outwards into that larger picture of what's going on the planet. But he also says we can go inwards, and we can actually encourage people in that more analytical science thing to go from that object in and see the beauty and mystery of that organism, that thing, the piece of rock, the crystals, the piece of history, and see the beauty inside it and the constituent elements. I think he really encouraged us to see the beauty at all these scales, from the object in to the object out. And when we see the environmental issues in front of us, climate change and biodiversity loss and culture loss, I think Yorke would say, don't despair. That look at all this stuff, look at how fabulous this stuff is, and just keep going on trying to educate, communicate, and ultimately, as he said, as I read his words, change people to see themselves more as being at home on Earth, on the planet.
Thanks, Rick. I was so hoping you were going to say he'd tell us to be hopeful and not despair. Thanks for that.
And maybe angry also.
Yes.
To get on with it, because he did have that sense of impatience with things that just weren't good.
Yeah, and if you're in love with something, you want to save it, right? You want to care for it, look after it. Yeah. Thank you both very much. There's so much more we could talk about, but we are at the top of the hour. I am going to ask Pam Murray to come on for a moment. Pam, you can put your camera on and your sound, because we're having another event tomorrow about the book. And so if anyone's available 10:30 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow, we're going to be doing a little something different around the book. Pam, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So tomorrow's session is called The Mentors, the Thing. And the idea for this really came from a Zoom call that Liz and Rick and I had when we were talking about ideas for launching the book, and realizing the influence that Yorke has had on interpretation in Canada and his legacy, and how, as I think Rick said earlier, there are a lot of us working in interpretation that maybe don't realize how much Yorke influenced us, and also don't take the time to stop and recognize our mentors and influences generally. So tomorrow is going to be an opportunity, if you work in interpretation, if you manage people who work in interpretation, if you used to work in interpretation and want to chat with a bunch of interpreters for a while, to explore Yorke's legacy and how he maybe influenced our mentors and influenced us, and talk about other mentors and influences in our field in Canada. So that's 10:30 tomorrow, and it's free like this, but we do ask people to pre-register. So it would be great to see some of you at that as well.
Thank you, Pam. And I would say,
Thanks,
thanks. If you're an educator or communicator of any kind, I think you'll get something out of this workshop tomorrow.
Yes.
And Rick and Rob are going to be there as well. It's excellent.
Yes, and there was somebody was specifically asking in the questions. We didn't get to the question about what advice Rick and Rob think that Yorke would have for emerging museum professionals, and tomorrow's conversation is a really great opportunity to go deeper into that kind of question. So, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Pam. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Sorry if we didn't get to your questions. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to go grab this fabulous book. And yeah, I think that's it. I don't think, unless I'm forgetting something, I don't think so. Somebody jump in if I am. I don't think I am. Thank you so much. And hopefully to see a lot of you tomorrow as well. And we are recording this, and it will be on YouTube in the next couple of days, so you can watch it again or share it with folks if you like. Thanks again so much, Rick and Rob, for sharing your stories about Yorke. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Liz.
Good night, everybody. Stay safe. Hope to see you in person soon.
Thank you all.